Okay, so today we're going deep on GEM Anscombe.
Ah,
And she really is a philosopher's philosopher.
oh,
Born
absolutely.
in 1919, died in 2001, and in that time,
Yeah.
really covered a huge amount of philosophical ground.
Yes, she did.
I mean, not just like, one little area, but we're talking ancient, medieval, modern, recent thought,
Mm-hmm.
metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, action, ethics,
Yeah.
politics,
Right.
philosophy of religion.
It's the whole buffet.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
the whole shebang.
Yeah.
Oh,
Um, if you like your philosophy hard,
yeah.
Anscombe is a particularly rewarding challenge.
Yeah.
A lot like her mentor, Wittgenstein, actually.
Yeah.
Very dense, very careful work required to unpack it. But the insights are there,
Absolutely.
particularly in action theory, moral philosophy, and the philosophy of mind.
Right. And I think that's what we're going to try and do in this deep dive is really kind of get into the nitty gritty of her ideas in
Yeah.
a way that I think would resonate with a fellow philosopher.
Absolutely.
So not a surface level overview.
No, really get into...
Connections, the surprising depth
Yeah.
of the arguments.
Okay, so I think to understand her philosophy, it's also helpful to understand her life a little bit.
Yeah.
So um, she was a convert to Roman Catholicism early on.
Early convert. Yeah, very important for her thought.
Yeah, and that really shaped her worldview throughout her career.
Mm-hmm.
And then academically, Oxford, Cambridge, met Wittgenstein there.
Huge influence, Wittgenstein, of course.
Massive influence, yeah.
Yeah.
Married to Peter Geach, another philosopher, so a
Uh,
real
Power couple.
power couple, yeah.
Yeah.
But then also, a real force in the public sphere.
Oh, yeah. She was not afraid of controversy.
No,
If her philosophical views led her to a controversial conclusion, she would,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, so we've got her opposition to the honorary degree for Harry Truman,
Right.
her very particular views on contraception,
Yeah.
her participation in protests outside abortion clinics.
So these weren't just, abstract philosophical positions. This
Right.
is really like, living it.
Lived philosophy.
Yeah, and all of that, I think, in the very male-dominated world of 20th century Anglo-American philosophy, carving out her own path.
Yeah, she really stands out.
Yeah.
So what we're going to try and do today is delve into some of those core contributions
Okay.
across all these different fields.
Yeah.
And what we'll see is that there are these really interesting and often unexpected connections between them.
I'm excited.
It's going to be good.
Let's start with the moral and political philosophy.
Okay.
Now, it doesn't really present itself as a system as such.
Right. It's not a systematic ethics.
But I think understanding these core elements is going to be really important for understanding her motivations as a whole.
It is.
Particularly, when we get to the stuff on action and intention,
Exactly.
which is some of her most well-known work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think a good place to start with this is her pamphlet, Mr. Truman's Degree, and the later essay, War and Murder.
Okay.
So in Mr. Truman's Degree, she's protesting against the awarding of an honorary degree to Harry Truman.
Mm-hmm.
And her reasoning is that he's a murderer
Wow.
for choosing to kill the innocent as a means to his ends.
That's a big charge to level.
It is.
Yeah.
It gets your attention as a philosopher.
It does.
So what she's particularly focused on is the civilian populations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right.
Her argument is that these people were non-combatants.
Yeah.
They weren't engaged in the fighting.
Right.
And the necessity of their deaths only arose because the Allies insisted on unconditional surrender.
Okay.
And she actually takes on directly some of the common ways people tried to justify Truman's actions.
Like what?
Well, the idea that he just signed a piece of paper.
Right.
He wasn't actually out there doing the killing,
Yeah.
or the analogy with killing sleeping enemy soldiers.
Right.
She sees these as deflections,
Yeah.
as failing to grasp what it means to intentionally do something,
Okay.
especially something like killing.
And I think this is going to be a theme
It is.
that runs through a lot of her work.
This question of what does it mean to do something intentionally?
Yeah.
Okay, so then in War and Murder, she gives a much fuller account of the distinction between murder and other kinds of killing.
Okay.
And for her, what makes something murder is that you're choosing to kill the innocent as it means to some further end.
Okay.
So that's contrasted with cases where maybe the death of some innocent people is foreseen, maybe even certain,
Right.
but it's not what you're choosing to do.
So she's got this example of giving pain relief to someone who's terminally ill.
Right.
And that might hasten their death.
Yeah, classic example.
Versus, bombing a civilian population to try and,
Break morale.
break morale and get them to surrender. So what's the difference there?
The difference is the structure of the action.
Okay.
In one case, the death of the innocent person is the thing you're using.
It's the lever you're pulling.
Exactly. It's the means to your end. In the other case, it's a side effect.
Okay.
It's something that you foresee, but it's not the thing you're aiming at.
Okay, so the structure of the action determines whether or not it counts as murder.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that in turn determines, what its moral status is.
Okay.
So she's very clear that you can never justify intentionally killing the innocent.
Okay.
But she does think there are cases where it's justified to use lethal force.
Okay. So she's not a pacifist.
No, she thinks that human societies need a state.
Right.
And the state has a right to use violence.
Even lethal violence?
Yeah, against attackers.
Okay.
But it can never be right to intentionally kill the innocent.
Okay, so that distinction between intended and merely foreseen consequences,
Yeah.
that seems really important to her.
Huge. Yeah, this is a core principle in Christian ethics.
Right.
And she's drawing on that tradition,
Okay.
but she's trying to give it a kind of philosophical grounding as well.
Okay, well then what about that idea of the double effect?
Right, so the doctrine of double effect is all about this distinction between intended and foreseen consequences.
Okay.
It's a very fine-grained distinction.
Yeah.
And she thinks it's not always well understood.
Right.
So she's not, spelling out the doctrine in detail,
Okay.
but she thinks you need to understand that distinction
Oh.
to really get clear on these ethical issues.
Okay, so one thing she's very critical of is what she calls direction of intention.
Oh, yeah, this is a really interesting idea.
So what is this?
It's the idea that you can kind of purify your intention
Right.
by focusing on a good aspect of what you're doing.
So how does that work?
Well, imagine a bomber pilot
Okay.
who's a devout Catholic,
Right.
and he says, look, I'm not intending to kill anyone.
Yeah.
I'm just intending to follow orders
Right.
for the greater good.
Okay.
Anscombe thinks this is just nonsense.
Okay.
You can't just direct your intention like that.
All
You're
right.
still killing people.
Okay.
And you know that you're killing people.
Yeah. Right, and she sees this as connected to a kind of Cartesian picture of the mind.
Oh, yeah, she hates that Cartesian stuff.
So what is that picture?
Well, it's the idea that the mind is this kind of separate realm,
Right.
disconnected from the body.
Okay.
And so you can have these pure intentions
Yeah.
that float free of your actions.
Right.
And she just thinks that's completely wrong.
Okay. So it's not enough just to appeal to religious doctrine here.
Right. You need to have a proper philosophical understanding of intention
Okay.
to see why this kind of reasoning doesn't work.
So how do we get that understanding?
Well, this is where modern moral philosophy comes in.
Okay, her most famous paper.
This is a landmark paper.
Yeah, everyone who studies ethics has to read this.
Absolutely.
And it's famous for containing 3 just absolutely radical theses.
They are shocking theses.
Yeah.
Really shake up the field.
Okay, so what's the first one?
First one is that moral philosophy just can't be done
Well, okay.
without an adequate philosophy of psychology,
Okay.
which she thinks we don't have. Right. The second one
Yeah.
is that moral philosophers should stop using concepts like moral obligation, moral duty.
And the ought.
Yeah, the ought.
Right.
And the third one is that there are no important differences between all the main English moral philosophers since Sidgwick.
Wow. Okay, that's a big one.
That's a big claim.
Okay, so let's take that third one first.
Okay.
So she's saying that, despite their apparent differences,
Yeah.
they're all united by this one crucial assumption.
Exactly.
Which
That
is-
there are some circumstances where it's okay to kill the innocent
Right.
if the consequences of not doing so would be really bad,
Really bad.
catastrophic.
Okay.
And she traces this back to Sidgwick
Okay.
and his view of intention.
Right.
So Sidgwick thought that you intend all the foreseen consequences of your actions.
Okay, so even if I'm not aiming at them,
Exactly.
if I can see that they're going to happen,
Yeah.
then I'm intending them.
That's Sidgwick's view.
Okay.
And even if the other philosophers she's talking about don't quite say that.
Right.
She thinks they're operating with a similar kind of picture,
Okay.
where you're responsible for all the foreseen consequences of your actions.
Equally responsible.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
what's wrong with that?
Well, she thinks it leads to this kind of consequentialist way of thinking,
Okay.
where the only thing that matters is the outcome.
Okay.
And so if you've got a case where you could kill one innocent person to save 5,
Right.
and you're equally responsible, whether you do that or you let the 5 die.
Right, because you're foreseeing their deaths.
Exactly.
Then the distinction between intentionally killing and just foreseeing a death.
It collapses.
Yeah.
And that's really dangerous.
Right, because then the prohibition on murder
Yeah.
loses its force.
Exactly.
Okay, so she's not happy with that?
No, she's not happy at all.
And she doesn't hold back in this paper.
No, this is a polemical piece.
Yeah, she's taken on some big names.
She's taking on Butler, Hume, Kant, Bentham Mill.
Wow. Okay, the whole gang. And it's interesting because you might expect her to be targeting, some radical new theory.
Right.
But her argument is that all these modern moral philosophers are just reflecting the morality of their time.
Exactly. They're just going with the flow.
So their philosophy is actually kind of conventional.
Yeah, it's just dressed up common sense.
And she makes this point even more forcefully in a BBC radio lecture.
Oh, yeah. What'd she say there?
Well, she suggests that English culture is morally corrupt.
Okay.
And that moral philosophy is just a symptom of that corruption.
So it's not even doing its job properly.
Right. It's not offering any real guidance.
Okay, so that's her critique of modern moral philosophy.
Okay, what about this second thesis?
Oh, right. The one about ditching moral obligation, duty, and the ought.
Yeah.
Okay, so her argument is that these concepts only make sense in a law-based ethics,
Okay.
where you've got some kind of moral lawgiver.
Like God.
Yeah, typically God,
Right.
who issues commands.
Oh,
So if you don't have that framework,
Mhm.
then talking about moral obligation is like talking about the law in a society where there are no laws.
right. Or like, shipwrecked survivors worrying about company policy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's just empty.
And this is different from Mackey's error theory.
Right. So Mackey thought that moral claims were false,
Yeah.
whereas Anscombe thinks they're meaningless.
Which is worse.
Yeah, she thinks it's a deeper problem.
Okay, so what's the solution?
Well, she suggests that we should focus on classifying actions
Okay.
in terms of whether they're truthful or untruthful, just or unjust, and so on.
Okay, so more descriptive terms.
Yeah.
Okay, so how does it help?
Well, it avoids this kind of empty moralizing
Okay.
that she sees in modern ethics.
Okay, and this connects to her contemporaries like Philippa Foot and Iris Murdoch.
Absolutely. So they were both very critical of utilitarianism,
Right?
and they were both suspicious of these very thin evaluative terms.
Like right and wrong.
Yeah, right and wrong, good and bad.
Okay.
They thought our moral language is much richer than that.
And this leads to the idea of thick moral concepts.
Exactly. So Bernard Williams is the one who really develops this idea.
Right.
And thick concepts are these concepts that are both action guiding and world guided.
Okay, so what does that mean?
It means they both tell you something about what to do,
Okay.
and they pick out real features of the world.
Okay. Can you give me an example?
Sure. So take the concept of courage.
Okay.
That tells you something about how to act.
Right. Be brave.
Yeah. But it also picks out a real feature of the world.
Okay. Like what?
Well, courageous people act in a certain way.
Right.
They overcome fear.
They stand up for what they believe in,
Exactly.
even when it's hard.
Yeah, so it's not just some abstract notion.
Okay.
It's grounded in how we actually experience the world.
Okay, so that's a thick concept.
Right.
And she thinks those are the concepts we should be using.
Yeah, she thinks they're much more informative.
More useful.
Yeah, more useful for thinking about ethics.
Okay, so then what about her first thesis?
Oh, right, the one about moral philosophy needing an adequate philosophy of psychology.
Yeah.
So it's important to note that she's not advocating for virtue ethics here.
Right.
Even though that's become a big thing since her time.
Yeah.
And some people see her as a kind of proto-virtue ethicist.
Right.
But she's not really doing that.
Oh, okay.
She's saying we need to get clear on these really basic psychological concepts.
Like what?
Well, she mentions action, intention, pleasure, wanting,
Right.
and maybe even virtue and flourishing.
Okay.
Although she doesn't really develop those last two very much.
Right.
But she thinks these are the building blocks,
Yeah.
and we need to get them right.
Before we can even start doing ethics.
Exactly.
I know, and there's been some debate about how seriously to take this.
Right. So some people think she's not being entirely sincere.
So they think maybe this is just a sneaky way of arguing for a God-based morality.
Yeah. Crisp, for example.
Right.
He thinks that she's basically saying that you need God to have a foundation for morality.
Okay. And she was a devout Catholic. She was.
And she clearly thought that some things were just wrong.
Yeah, like murder.
Yeah, murder.
Yeah.
So is that what she's doing?
Well, it's hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
But I think it's more likely that she's just really concerned about getting the foundations right.
Okay.
And she thinks that if you're not working within a theistic framework,
Yeah.
then you need to do this work on philosophy of psychology.
Right.
before you can do anything else.
Okay, so she's not saying we should just give up on ethics altogether.
Yeah.
It's more like, you need to have the right tools
Exactly.
before you can start building the house.
Yeah.
Good analogy.
So she's not saying that, people should just go around murdering each other.
No, of course not.
It's more that if you're going to try and give a philosophical account of why murder is wrong,
Right.
you need to have a proper understanding of what action is, what intention is.
Exactly.
All that stuff.
And she thought that a lot of her contemporaries were just skipping over that step.
And just assuming they knew what those things were. It's exactly. She's saying, no. You can't just assume.
You need to do the work.
Yeah, you need to actually do the philosophical work.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on to metaphysics.
Okay.
And I think one of the areas where she made really important contributions is in her work on causation.
Yeah, this is a big one.
Yeah.
And it's connected to her interest in human freedom.
Right.
Which we've already touched on a bit.
Yeah, so how does she see causation?
And in her famous paper, Causality and Determination, she challenges the orthodox human in view.
Which is
that causation is just regular succession.
Right, so if A happens, then B happens.
Yeah, and that happens over and over again.
Then we say A causes B.
Exactly.
Okay.
But Anscombe says, no, that's not enough.
Okay.
She distinguishes between causality and determination.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Well, something can be caused without being determined.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. So imagine a Geiger counter hooked up to a bomb.
Okay.
This is Feynman's example. So if the Geiger counter detects a certain level of radiation, the bomb explodes.
Right.
But whether or not that level of radiation is reached depends on all sorts of chance factors.
Right.
Like radioactive decay.
Okay.
So the explosion is caused by the Geiger counter,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not determined by it.
Okay, because there's this element of chance.
Exactly.
Okay, and this is important for her view of free will.
It is.
Because if all our actions were determined, then we wouldn't be free.
Right.
So she needs there to be this space for
genuine agency.
Yeah.
For us to be able to do otherwise.
Right.
And she thinks that this distinction between causality and determination opens up that space.
Okay, so she's an indeterminist.
Yes, she is.
Okay. And what about this other paper, the first person?
Ah, yes. This is a very strange and interesting paper.
Yeah.
It's about the word I.
Okay.
And she argues that it's not a referring expression.
So what does that mean?
It means that it doesn't work like other words that refer to things.
Okay.
So like a proper name.
Right, like Gertrude Anscombe.
Yeah, or a pronoun like she.
Okay.
Or demonstrative like this.
Right.
Or a definite description like the tallest person in the room.
Okay.
All of those expressions pick out a particular thing in the world.
Okay.
But she thinks I doesn't do that.
Okay, so how does she argue for that?
Well, she starts by looking at Descartes.
Right.
And his famous cogito argument.
Right. I think, therefore I am.
Yeah, so Descartes is trying to find something that he can't doubt.
Right.
And he thinks he's found it in the I.
Okay.
But Anscombe says, hold on a minute.
Yeah.
If you can doubt that you have a body,
right,
you could doubt that you're Descartes.
Right, because Descartes is just a name.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the thought, Descartes was not Descartes.
Yeah.
Doesn't have the same kind of immediate impossibility.
As I am not Descartes.
Exactly.
Right.
Because when you say I am not Descartes, you're using the I in a special way.
Right.
That seems to guarantee that it refers to you.
Okay.
But she thinks that that's an illusion.
Okay.
She thinks I doesn't actually refer to anything.
But how can we talk about ourselves then?
Well, she thinks that we don't actually need the I.
Okay.
She points out that some languages don't have a separate first-person pronoun.
Right.
And they seem to get along just fine.
Okay. So she's not saying that we can't think about ourselves or
No.
talk about ourselves. It's more that the I is not essential for doing that.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a very radical view.
It is.
And it's been very influential in philosophy of language and philosophy of mind.
It has, yeah. People are still debating it today.
Okay, so let's move on to her work on intention.
Ah, yes. This is her most famous work.
Yeah, Intention, the book.
This is a classic.
It's a really important book.
It's one of those books that everyone cites.
Yeah.
But not everyone reads.
Right.
Villain famously said it's often quoted, sometimes read, rarely understood.
Yeah, and it's dense.
It is.
It's not an easy read.
No.
But it's worth the effort.
It is.
So what's she trying to do in this book?
Well, she's trying to understand what it means to act intentionally.
Okay.
And she's motivated by her disagreement with the people who tried to justify Truman's actions.
Right.
She thinks they just didn't understand what intention is.
Okay.
So she's trying to get really clear on that.
Okay.
And she does it in a very distinctive way.
Okay.
So instead of starting with, some kind of general theory of mind,
Yeah.
she starts with the concept of intention,
Okay.
and she tries to work out what that means.
Okay. And this is important because...
Well, she thinks that the concept of intention is baked into a lot of our other concepts,
Oh.
like the concept of action.
Right.
You can't really understand what it means to act
Yeah.
without understanding what it means to intend to do something.
Okay.
So she starts with a bunch of examples,
Okay.
and she tries to tease out the different ways in which we use the word intentional.
Right.
And one of her key insights is that intention is relative to a description.
Okay, so what does that mean?
It means that a single action can be described in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
And it might be intentional under some descriptions,
Right.
but not others.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Sure. So
Yeah.
imagine I'm pumping water.
Okay.
I'm doing that intentionally,
Right.
but I'm also casting a shadow.
Right.
I'm not doing that intentionally.
Okay.
So the same action can be intentional or unintentional,
Right.
depending on how you describe it.
Okay, so how do we know which descriptions are the intentional ones?
Well, she gives a sort of disjunctive account at first.
Okay.
So she says, if you ask someone, why are you doing that?
Yeah.
And they say, I didn't know I was doing that, or,
Right.
or just observed that I was doing that,
Right.
then it wasn't intentional.
Okay.
But if they give you a reason,
Yeah.
like, I'm doing it to achieve this goal,
Right.
or I'm doing it because I promised to,
Right.
or even no reason,
Yeah.
then it was probably intentional.
Okay, so it's about the kind of answer you give.
Yeah. But then she kind of shifts gear,
Okay.
and she says, look, what's really going on here
Yeah.
is that in intentional action, you know what you're doing
Okay.
without observing or inferring it.
Right, so it's not like you're looking at yourself and saying, oh, I guess I'm doing this.
Exactly.
It's more like you just know.
You just know.
Okay.
And this is what she calls practical knowledge.
Okay.
And she says the only way to understand practical knowledge
Yeah.
is to understand practical reasoning.
Okay, so what is practical reasoning?
Well, it's not just about figuring out the best means to an end,
Okay.
like Aristotle thought.
Right.
It's about the order of your intentions.
Okay, so what does that mean?
Well, imagine you're doing something complicated,
Okay.
like building a house.
Right.
There are all sorts of different actions involved.
Yeah.
And those actions are connected by reasons.
Okay.
So you're laying bricks because you're building a wall.
Right.
You're building a wall because you're building a house.
Right.
And that order of reasons, that's the order of your intentions.
Okay.
And it's not just in your head.
Right.
It's a real order in the world.
Okay, so how do we know that order?
Well, this is where practical knowledge comes in.
Okay.
You have a special kind of access to that order
Right.
because you're the one doing the intending.
Right.
It's like the project director who can't see the building,
Right.
but they know what's being done.
Because they're the ones giving the orders.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's practical knowledge.
Yeah. Okay,
Right.
and it's not just knowledge of individual actions.
Right.
It's knowledge of the whole means and structure.
Of your activity.
Exact.
Okay, and she thinks this is really important.
It is.
Because a lot of the concepts we use to describe human behavior, like greeting, hiring, offending.
All those things,
Yeah.
they all presuppose intention.
Right.
You can't greet someone unintentionally.
Okay.
You can't hire someone unintentionally.
Right.
So intention is not just something we add on to behavior.
Right.
It's built into how we understand our lives.
Okay. And then she has this famous shopping list example.
Oh, yeah, this is a good one.
So what's going on there?
Well, she's trying to show that there are two ways to know what's going on.
Okay.
One is by recording what happens,
Okay.
and the other is by making it happen.
Okay.
So imagine you've got a shopping list,
Right.
and you go to the store.
Yeah.
If the list is just a record of what you bought,
Yeah.
then if it doesn't match what you actually bought,
Right.
the mistake is in the list.
Right.
But if the list is an order of what you're supposed to buy,
Right.
then if you buy the wrong thing,
Yeah.
the mistake is in your action.
Right.
So there are two different ways to go wrong here.
Okay.
You can misrecord what happened.
Host?